The world we live in today, a world of satellites orbiting the Earth, of tides that rise and fall with predictable precision, of light that can be split and studied, began, in many ways, in the mind of a single planetary man. But before he was a giant of science, he was a child, and before he understood the gravity that binds the stars, he felt the weight of loneliness. Tonight, we journey back to the 17th century, to a time of candle wax and quill pens, to an England torn apart by civil war and ravaged by plague. We will walk the stone floors of Trinity College, sit in the darkened rooms of Woolsthorpe Manor, and look over the shoulder of a man who dared to ask why the apple falls. This is the story of Isaac Newton, not just the mathematician, but the mystic, the alchemist, the fragile boy who built a fortress of logic to protect a vulnerable heart. So, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to a winter night in 1642, where the story of the modern universe begins in the dark. Chapter 1. The Solitary Seed, 1642 to 1649. The story begins not with triumph, but with fragility. It was Christmas Day 1642. In the hamlet of Woolsthorpe, nestled in the English countryside of Lincolnshire, the wind howled through the cracks of a grey limestone manor. The nation was uneasy. The drums of the English Civil War were beating in the distance. But inside the manor, a different struggle was taking place. A woman named Hannah was giving birth. The baby arrived prematurely. He was tiny, so small, it was said, that he could fit comfortably inside a quart mug. His neck was so frail that a special collar had to be bolstered around it just to keep his head upright. The midwives who attended to Hannah whispered that the child would not last the day. They sent messengers to retrieve supplies, fully expecting to return to a house of mourning. But the boy fought. He clung to life with a stubborn persistence that would define his entire existence. They named him Isaac, after his father. However, the tragedy of Isaac's life had struck before he even took his first breath. His father, an illiterate but prosperous yeoman farmer, had died 3 months prior. Isaac was born into a house of ghosts, the only son of a grieving widow. For the first 3 years, it was just Isaac and Hannah, a quiet, sealed world. But this bond was destined to break. When Isaac was 3 years old, his mother made a decision that would shatter his world. She accepted a marriage proposal from a wealthy clergyman from a neighboring village, the Reverend Barnabas Smith. But there was a cruel condition to this union. The Reverend wanted the wife, not the stepson. And so, on a day that must have etched itself into the deepest recesses of Isaac's memory, his mother packed her things. She moved to the rectory in North Witham, just 1.5 miles away. She did not take Isaac. He was left behind at Woolsthorpe Manor, in the care of his elderly grandparents. Imagine the internal world of that small boy. He could see the steeple of the church where his mother now lived from his own garden. She was so close, yet entirely inaccessible. This separation planted a seed of deep, abiding insecurity in Isaac. He was a child rejected. In his later confessions, written in a private notebook, he would admit to a dark, childish rage, threatening in his imagination to burn the house down over his mother and stepfather. It was a silent, brooding anger. He did not play rough games with other children. He did not seek affection, for he had learned that affection was unreliable. Instead, he turned inward. He began to find comfort not in people who could leave, but in things, in wood, in stone, in the predictable motion of the wind. And so the foundations of his genius were laid not in a classroom, but in the lonely silence of an abandoned nursery. He learned to be alone, and in that loneliness, he began to watch the world with an intensity that no one else possessed. Chapter 2. The Mechanical Boy, 1650 to 1660. As the years turned, the frail infant grew into a quiet, observant boy. When he was 12 years old, Isaac was sent to the King's School in Grantham, a market town several miles from his home. It was here that the mechanical boy truly began to emerge. He lodged in the home of Mr. Clark, the local apothecary. This was a stroke of immense luck. The apothecary's house was a wonderland of chemicals, dried herbs, strange powders, and books. It smelled of curiosity. While other boys played ball or chased each other through the streets, Isaac was in the attic. He had a little set of tools, saws, hammers, chisels, that he cherished more than any toy. He began to build. He constructed a miniature windmill, modeled after one being built near the town. But Isaac's was better. He equipped it with a treadmill run by a mouse. He built water clocks that dripped with steady precision, marking the time on the wall. He built paper lanterns, which he would fly at night attached to the tails of kites, terrifying the local farmers who thought they were seeing comets or spirits in the dark sky. Yet, despite his brilliance with machines, he was not a prodigy in the classroom, at least not initially. The records tell us he sat near the bottom of his class. He was dreamy, distracted, his mind wandering to the gears of his clocks rather than the conjugation of Latin verbs. This changed due to a moment of violence. One day, a school bully, a boy who ranked just above him in class, kicked Isaac in the stomach. It was a physical humiliation. But Isaac did not just fight back with his fists. He fought back with his mind. He challenged the bully to a fight in the churchyard and won, rubbing the boy's nose against the church wall. But that wasn't enough for Isaac. He needed to dominate him completely. Isaac vowed to surpass the bully in intellect. He began to study with a ferocious intensity. He climbed the rankings of the school, passing the bully, passing everyone, until he sat alone at the top. It was a pattern that would repeat for the rest of his life. Isaac Newton did not tolerate rivals. During this time, there was softness, too. He formed a gentle friendship with the apothecary's stepdaughter, a girl named Catherine Storer. They say he built dollhouse furniture for her. It was perhaps the only romantic connection Newton ever had. But the call of the mind was stronger than the call of the heart. In 1659, his mother, now widowed a second time, pulled him out of school. She demanded he return to Woolsthorpe to manage the family farm. It was a disaster. Isaac would be found reading under a hedge while the sheep wandered into the cornfields. He would build water wheels in the stream while the fences fell into disrepair. He was fined by the manor court for allowing his swine to trespass. He was a terrible farmer. Fortunately, his schoolmaster, Mr. Stokes, and his uncle recognized that this boy was not made for the plow. They pleaded with his mother. "Let him return to his books," they urged. "He is fit for nothing else." Reluctantly, Hannah agreed. Isaac returned to Grantham to finish his studies, and then, in the summer of 1661, he packed his bags. He was leaving the farm, the sheep, and the silence of Lincolnshire. Cambridge was waiting. Chapter 3. The Sizer of Trinity, 1661 to 1664. Isaac arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, in June of 1661. He was 18 years old, somewhat older than the other freshmen, and socially invisible. He entered as a sub-sizar. This was a lowly rank. It meant that despite his mother's wealth, he paid his way through college by performing menial tasks for the wealthier students, emptying chamber pots, waiting on tables, cleaning boots. It was a humbling experience. While the young aristocrats drank wine and gambled in the taverns, the servant scholar Newton ate his meals in silence and retreated to his room. The university at that time was, frankly, stagnant. The curriculum was dominated by the teachings of Aristotle, unchanged for centuries. Students were taught that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that matter was made of earth, air, fire, and water. Isaac dutifully read the required texts, but in his spare time, he discovered a different world. He found the writings of the French philosopher René Descartes. He read about a universe that worked like a machine, governed by mechanical particles in motion. He read the works of Galileo and Kepler. He began a new notebook. At the top of the page, he wrote a phrase in Latin, Amicus Plato, Amicus Aristoteles, Magis Amica Veritas. Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my best friend is truth. This was the turning point. The student was rejecting the masters. In this notebook, which he titled Quaestiones, Questions, he listed everything he didn't understand. He asked questions about the nature of matter, about the vacuum, about God, and most importantly, about light. He was beginning to experiment on himself, often recklessly. In one terrifying instance, trying to understand how vision worked, he took a bodkin, a thick needle used for sewing leather, and inserted it between his eye and the bone, pressing it as far back as he could to change the curvature of his retina. He saw colored circles, dark and light. He stared at the sun in a mirror for hours until he almost blinded himself, forcing him to stay in a dark room for days until his vision recovered. He was fearless, he was obsessive, and he was entirely alone in his inquiries. By 1664, he had secured a scholarship, freeing him from his menial duties. He was ready to begin his academic career in earnest. But history had other plans. In London, the rats were moving, the fleas were biting, the Great Plague was coming. Chapter 4. The Year of Wonders, 1665 to 1606. In the summer of 1665, the Black Death descended upon England. The University of Cambridge closed its gates. The students and professors scattered to the countryside to escape the contagion. Isaac Newton packed his trunks once again. He loaded them with books and blank paper, and he returned home to Woolsthorpe Manor. He was 23 years old. The next 18 months would become known in history as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders. While the world outside was dying, while the death carts rolled through the streets of London and mass graves were dug in the churchyards, Isaac Newton retreated into a profound solitude. There were no professors to guide him, no lectures to attend, no distractions. Just the quiet of the farmhouse, the ticking of the clock, and the boundless capability of his own mind. In the span of these few months, Newton would essentially invent the foundation of modern science. He looked at mathematics. He realized that algebra and geometry could be united to calculate things that were constantly changing. The speed of a falling object, the orbit of a planet. He called it the method of fluxions. Today, we call it calculus. He looked at light. He bored a hole in his window shutter, allowing a single beam of sunlight to strike a glass prism. The conventional wisdom said the prism colored the white light. Newton proved them wrong. He showed that white light held all the colors of the rainbow within it, and the prism merely separated them. And then there was the apple. The story has been told 1,000 times, often as a cartoonish myth, but the truth is far more contemplative. It was late summer, the heat was breaking. Isaac was sitting in the garden at Woolsthorpe, in a contemplative mood, as he later told his biographer. He watched an apple fall from a tree. Thud. It fell straight down. Why? Why did it not go sideways? Why did it not go upwards? Why is it constantly drawn to the center of the earth? And then his mind leaped. He looked up, past the apple tree, to the pale ghost of the moon in the afternoon sky. If the earth pulls the apple, does it also pull the moon? Imagine the audacity of that thought. In 1666, the earth was the earth, and the heavens were the heavens. They were different realms, governed by different laws. Newton dared to think that the same invisible hand that grasped the apple also grasped the moon. He rushed back to his room. He calculated the force required to keep the moon in orbit. He compared it to the force of gravity on the surface of the earth. The numbers were close. As he famously wrote later, "I found them answer pretty nearly." In that quiet farmhouse, surrounded by sheep and silence, Isaac Newton had mentally tied the universe together. But here is the most baffling part of the story. When the plague passed and he returned to Cambridge in 1667, he did not run to the printing press. He did not shout his discoveries from the rooftops. He put his papers in a drawer. He told almost no one. He locked the universe away in his desk, and there it would stay, hidden for nearly 20 years. Chapter 5. The Mirror and the Eye, 1667 to 1671. The plague years ended. The universities reopened their doors, and Isaac Newton returned to Cambridge, no longer a student, but a fellow. By 1669, at the shockingly young age of 26, he became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. To the outside world, he was a rising academic star. But inside his chambers at Trinity College, he was a man obsessed with the problem of craftsmanship. For decades, astronomers had struggled with telescopes. They used glass lenses, but these lenses acted like prisms. They blurred the images of stars with fringes of color. To fix this, telescopes had to be made ridiculously long. Some were over 100 feet, unwieldy giants swaying in the wind. Newton, trusting his earlier discovery, that color comes from the light itself, realized glass lenses were a dead end. He needed a mirror, and so the mathematician became a mechanic. In the quiet of his rooms, Newton built a furnace. He melted down metals, copper, tin, and arsenic, trying to find an alloy that would polish to a perfect reflective shine. The air in his room grew thick with toxic fumes. His hands were stained and burned. He cast the mirror himself. He ground it into a perfect curve, not with a machine, but with his own patient, rhythmic motion, hour after hour. The result was a tiny telescope, barely 6 inches long. It looked like a toy, but when he looked through it, the image was crystal clear. He had compressed the power of a giant into a tube the size of a rolling pin. It was a triumph of engineering, but it was also the bait that would drag the recluse out of his shell and into the line of fire. Chapter 6. The First Shadow, 1671 to 1675. News of this wonder tube reached London. The Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific body in the world, asked to see it. In late 1671, the telescope arrived in London. The king himself, Charles II, examined it. The members of the society were dazzled. They elected Newton as a fellow immediately. For a brief moment, Isaac felt the warmth of acceptance. Flushed with this success, he decided to share something even more precious, his theory of light and color. He sent them a paper detailing his experiments with the prisms. He expected applause. Instead, he found a rival. Enter Robert Hooke. Hooke was the curator of experiments for the Royal Society. He was brilliant, energetic, and famously combative. He was a man who believed he had already explained light. When he read Newton's paper, he did not see a breakthrough. He saw an attack on his own theories. Hooke wrote a critique. It was condescending. He treated Newton not as a peer, but as a beginner who had stumbled. Newton did not handle this well. We must understand Newton's internal world to understand what happened next. He was a man of extreme fragility. To Newton, his discoveries were not just scientific opinions. They were divine truths he had uncovered. To doubt them was to doubt reality itself. He flew into a rage. He wrote scathing letters back to London. He threatened to quit the society. He declared that philosophy was such an impertinently litigious lady that a man would be a fool to have anything to do with her. It was during this feud that Newton wrote one of the most famous sentences in history in a letter to Hooke. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." History often reads this as humility, but many historians believe it was a veiled insult. Robert Hooke was a man of short stature and a hunched back. By saying he stood on the shoulders of giants, Newton may have been cruelly reminding Hooke that he was not one of them. The experience scarred Newton. He retreated. He learned that sharing his work brought pain. So he decided to stop sharing. He pulled up the drawbridge. For the next decade, the world would hear almost nothing from Isaac Newton. Chapter 7. The Alchemist's Furnace, 1675 to 1680. If you were to walk past Newton's rooms at Trinity College during the 1670s, late at night, you would see a strange flickering glow coming from the window. You would smell sulfur and mercury. The world thought Newton was working on math, but in secret, he had turned to the black arts. Newton became an alchemist. Today we separate science from magic, but for Newton, they were two sides of the same coin. He believed that the ancients possessed a secret wisdom that had been lost. He believed that metals were not dead, but alive, that they could grow and vegetate. He was searching for the philosopher's stone, a substance that could purify base metals into gold. But it wasn't about greed. It was about understanding the mind of God. He wanted to find the active spirit that animated the universe. He spent sleepless nights tending his furnaces. His notebooks from this time are filled not with equations, but with bizarre recipes and code names. The green lion, the star regulus of antimony, the net. He tasted the chemicals he made. He recorded the taste of mercury, of arsenic, of lead. It is a miracle he did not kill himself. In fact, modern analysis of a lock of Newton's hair showed massive levels of mercury. This chemical poisoning may explain his behavior, his paranoia, his insomnia, his erratic temper. He was literally driving himself mad in the pursuit of hidden truth. He wrote over 1,000,000 words on alchemy, 1,000,000 words, and yet he published none of it. It was a secret fire burning in the dark. Chapter 8. The Dangerous Heresy, 1675 to 1685. But alchemy was not his only secret. Newton was hiding something even more dangerous, something that, if discovered, would not just cost him his job, it could cost him his freedom. Newton had begun to study the Bible with the same forensic intensity he applied to nature. He taught himself Hebrew, he analyzed the ancient texts, and he came to a shocking conclusion. He believed that the Holy Trinity, the central doctrine of the Christian Church, was a fraud. He believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but he was not God's equal. He believed that the Church had corrupted the text of the Bible in the 4th century to introduce a false idol. Pause to consider the irony. Newton was a fellow of Trinity College. His paycheck, his home, his status, all depended on him swearing an oath to the Trinity. He was living a lie. Every day he wore the robes of the college. Every day he prayed in the chapel. But in his private manuscripts, he was dismantling the very religion he publicly professed. He was an Arian, a heretic in the eyes of the Church of England. If exposed, he would be stripped of his professorship and cast out of polite society. So, he kept his theology in the same place as his alchemy and his calculus, locked in the box. The pressure of these secrets turned him into a man of iron control. He could not afford to slip. He could not afford to be close to anyone. He was the lonely guardian of a dangerous truth. Chapter 9. The Visit of Halley, 1684. By 1684, Newton was in his early 40s. He was graying, solitary, and largely forgotten by the scientific community in London. But in the coffee houses of London, a question was brewing. Three men, Christopher Wren, the architect, Robert Hooke, the old rival, and Edmund Halley, a young, charming astronomer, were debating planetary motion. They suspected that a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance kept the planets in orbit, but they couldn't prove it. Hooke bragged that he had the proof, but he refused to show it. Tired of the bluster, Edmund Halley decided to go to the one man who might actually know the answer. He took a carriage to Cambridge. The meeting between Halley and Newton is one of the most consequential moments in the history of civilization. Halley entered Newton's austere room. He skipped the pleasantries. He asked Newton, if the force of gravity weakens with the square of the distance, what curve would the planets describe? Newton answered immediately, an ellipse. Halley was stunned. How do you know? I have calculated it, Newton said. Halley asked to see the calculation. Newton rummaged through his messy papers. He looked in his drawers. He couldn't find it. Imagine Halley's panic. The key to the universe was lost in a pile of old notes. But Newton, perhaps feeling a flicker of his old ambition, promised to redo the calculation and send it to Halley. Halley left, perhaps thinking the eccentric professor would forget, but he had lit a fuse. Chapter 10. The Writing of the Principia, 1685 to 1687. Newton did not just redo the calculation, he stopped the world. The question from Halley reawakened the giant. Newton realized that his old calculations were just fragments. He needed to build a complete system, a new physics that explained everything, from the tides of the ocean to the comets in the sky. He shut the door. For 18 months, Isaac Newton barely existed as a human being. He lived in a state of sustained, trance-like concentration. His servants reported that he would often forget to eat. They would bring a tray of food and return hours later to find it untouched. He would stand by his bed in the morning, half-dressed, staring into space for hours, his mind locked on a geometry problem. He worked day and night. He gave lectures to empty rooms because he was obligated to, talking to the walls while the students, bored and confused, stayed away. He was channeling the entirety of his intellect into one manuscript, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. In this book, he defined mass, force, and time. He laid out the three laws of motion. He explained the law of universal gravitation. It was a brutal process. The mathematics were incredibly difficult. He had to invent new proofs as he went along. He was exhausted, paranoid, and on the edge of collapse. But he finished. In 1687, thanks to the patience and money of Edmund Halley, who paid for the printing out of his own pocket, the Principia was published. It was not a bestseller. It was written in dense Latin, intentionally difficult so that, as Newton said, to avoid being baited by little smatterers in mathematics. But for those who could read it, it was a revelation. The universe was no longer a chaotic place of spirits and mysteries. It was a clockwork mechanism governed by precise mathematical laws. The solitary boy from Woolsthorpe had done it. He had decoded the architecture of God. Chapter 11. The Black Year, 1692 to 1693. After the triumph of the Principia, one might expect Isaac Newton to find peace. He was now the most famous mathematician in Europe, but the mind that had unraveled the universe was beginning to unravel itself. By 1692, Newton was 50 years old. The exhaustion of writing the Principia had drained him. He was physically depleted and emotionally brittle. To make matters worse, his few human connections were snapping. He had formed a deep, intense attachment to a young Swiss mathematician named Nicolas Fatio de Duillier. It was the closest emotional bond of Newton's adult life. But in 1693, that relationship abruptly ended. We do not know why. The loss sent Newton spiraling into a nervous breakdown. He stopped sleeping. For 5 nights in a row, not a wink. The shadows in his room at Trinity College seemed to lengthen and twist. He became convinced that his few friends were plotting against him. In a state of delirium, he wrote wild, accusing letters. He wrote to the philosopher John Locke, a man who had been nothing but kind to him, with these chilling words: "Sir, being of opinion that you endeavored to embroil me with women, and by other means, I was so much affected with it, that when one told me you were sickly and would not live, I answered, 'Twere better if you were dead.'" Imagine the horror of receiving such a letter from the greatest mind of the age. He also wrote to the diarist Samuel Pepys, confessing, "I am extremely troubled at the embroilment I am in, and have neither ate nor slept well this 12-month, nor have my former consistency of mind." Rumors swirled that Newton had gone mad. There was even a story, likely a myth, but a telling one, that his dog, Diamond, had knocked over a candle and burned his laboratory, destroying 20 years of work, and that this loss had snapped his mind. Whether it was the fire, the mercury poisoning from his alchemy, or a broken heart, 1693 was the year the light flickered. The genius was lost in the dark. Chapter 12. The Tower and the Mint, 1696. Newton eventually recovered his sanity, but he was changed. The creative spark of his youth, the ability to hold the entire cosmos in his head, was fading. He knew it. He needed an escape. He could no longer bear the silence of Cambridge. He wanted noise. He wanted action. And perhaps he wanted power. In 1696, a letter arrived from London that offered him a way out. He was offered the position of Warden of the Royal Mint. Most people treated this job as a sinecure, a cushy title with a fat salary where you did no work. But Isaac Newton did not know how to do no work. He packed his bags and left Cambridge for good. He moved into an apartment within the walls of the Tower of London, where the Mint was housed. Imagine the shock of the transition. For 30 years, he had lived in the quiet, stone cloisters of a university. Now, he lived in a prison fortress, surrounded by the clamor of the city, the clanking of coin presses, and the smell of the Thames. England was in the midst of a financial crisis. The silver currency was being clipped and counterfeited to the point of collapse. The nation was on the verge of bankruptcy. Newton approached the problem of money with the same rigor he had applied to gravity. He reorganized the factories. He analyzed the motion of the workers to increase efficiency. He oversaw the great recoinage, recalling millions of old coins and minting new ones. The philosopher had become a bureaucrat, and he was ruthless. Chapter 13. The Detective, 1696 to 1699. But his role as warden had a darker side. It was Newton's job to catch counterfeiters. Counterfeiting was considered high treason, punishable by death. But catching these criminals was difficult. They operated in the shadowy underworld of London's taverns and brothels, a world utterly alien to the puritanical Newton. Yet, he seemed to relish the challenge. He built a network of spies and informers. He paid criminals to betray their friends. He donned disguises to meet informants in back alleys. His greatest nemesis was a man named William Challoner. Challoner was a charismatic rogue, a master counterfeiter who had grown rich by mocking the law. He thought he could outsmart the professor. He taunted Newton publicly, calling him an incompetent fraud. He made a fatal mistake. He challenged Newton's pride. Newton hunted him down with cold mathematical precision. He spent months gathering evidence, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, cross-referencing their stories until he had built an unbreakable chain of logic. When Challoner was finally dragged before the court, he saw the dossier Newton had compiled. He realized he was doomed. He wrote pleading letters to Newton, begging for mercy. "Oh, dear sir, do this for me, and I will be your slave forever." Newton did not answer. He did not care for mercy. He cared for justice. On March 20, 1699, William Challoner was dragged on a sledge to Tyburn and hanged. Newton did not attend the execution. He had simply solved the equation. The variable had been eliminated. Chapter 14. The Autocrat of Science, 1703 to 1720. With the currency saved and his enemies vanquished, Newton ascended to the very peak of society. In 1703, he was elected president of the Royal Society. He would hold this post for 24 years, ruling British science with an iron fist. In 1705, Queen Anne visited Cambridge. There, in the great hall of Trinity College, she tapped the sword on his shoulder. He rose as Sir Isaac Newton, the first scientist in history to be knighted. But power did not mellow him. It made him more tyrannical. A massive dispute broke out across Europe. The German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz had published a method of calculus. It used different notation than Newton's unpublished notes, but the results were the same. Did Leibniz steal it, or did they discover it independently? Newton was incapable of sharing the podium. He unleashed a campaign of character assassination against Leibniz. He used his position as president of the Royal Society to appoint an impartial committee to investigate the matter. But, in secret, Newton wrote the committee's report himself. He reviewed his own case, found in his own favor, and then published it anonymously. He tried to erase Leibniz from history. When Leibniz died, Newton reportedly said he took great satisfaction in breaking Leibniz's heart. It was a petty, vindictive war, but it solidified Newton's status. He was not just a scientist anymore. He was a monument. Chapter 15. The Final Orbit, 1720-1727. As he entered his 80s, the great mind began to slow. He lived in a grand house in London, cared for by his niece, Catherine Barton. He was a wealthy man, a celebrity visited by travelers from all over the world. He spent his final years sorting through his papers, but he was also burning them. He stood by the fireplace, tossing manuscripts into the flames. Perhaps he was destroying his alchemical recipes, or his heretical writings about the Trinity. He was curating his own legacy, ensuring that the world would see only the golden idol, not the flawed man. In his last days, he was reflective. Despite his arrogance, despite his wars, he looked back on his life with a sudden, touching humility. He told a friend, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself and now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." In March 1727, the pain of a bladder stone became unbearable. He refused medication. He slipped into a coma. On March 20th, 1727, at the age of 84, Isaac Newton breathed his last. He was given a state funeral, an honor usually reserved for kings. His pallbearers were dukes and earls. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, among the monarchs of England. Voltaire, the French philosopher who was in London at the time, watched the procession in amazement. He wrote, "I have seen a professor of mathematics only because he was great in his vocation, buried like a king who had done good to his subjects." The boy who had been abandoned in a farmhouse had finished his journey. He had changed the way humanity saw the universe, forever. If you visit Westminster Abbey today, you can find his grave. It is a grand monument. A statue of Newton reclines there, surrounded by books and instruments, his elbow resting on the works of his life. Above him, a globe maps the path of a comet. The inscription is written in Latin. It praises him as the man who, by a strength of mind almost divine, first demonstrated the motions and figures of the planets. But stone is cold, and statues are silent. To truly find Isaac Newton, you do not need to go to London. You do not need to visit a museum. You simply need to look out your window. We live even now in Newton's world. Every time a plane takes off, lifting against the drag of the air, it is obeying his laws. Every time a bridge holds the weight of a train, every time a satellite sends a signal to your phone, every time the tide pulls away from the shore, it is the invisible clockwork that Newton revealed. Later scientists, like Einstein, would come along to bend the rules, to show us that space and time are flexible. But for the things we can touch, for the life we live here on Earth, Newton remains the master. Yet, as we close his story tonight, we must remember the man behind the marble. He was not a machine. He was a man who felt things too deeply, a man who was abandoned as a child, who built a fortress of knowledge to protect himself from a world he found frightening. He was a magician who accidentally became a scientist. He looked at the Bible and the alchemist's furnace with the same obsession he applied to the prism. He was searching for one thing: unity. He wanted to know the mind of God. He taught us that the universe is not a place of chaos. It is a place of order. It is predictable. It is reliable. There is a comfort in that thought, especially in the dark. To know that the sun will rise at a specific time. To know that the moon will hold its course. To know that the earth beneath us is solid, held together by a force that, while invisible, never fails. Newton once said that he felt like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. He found his pebbles, he built his castle of sand, and then he returned to the ocean. Now, the farmhouse at Woolsthorpe is quiet. The apple tree, grown from the roots of the original, still stands in the garden. The wind still blows through the Lincolnshire grass. The problems of his life, the rivalries, the anger, the loneliness, have all faded away. All that remains is the light he understood so well. So, let the gravity that he discovered hold you now. Let the weight of the day fall away, just as the apple falls to the earth. The universe is turning silently and safely in the dark. Rest now. The stars are watching. Good night,